IB Biology Topic 3.1 Genes Applications and Skills Point 2 Comparison of the number of genes in humans and other species. This video won't be an explanation of why certain kinds of life have more or fewer chromosomes or genes, but rather a comparison, for you to see what kinds of life have more genes than other kinds. And we'll be starting here with this phylogenetic tree of life that shows us the three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. We then divide each of these domains into kingdoms, and every single one of these branches you see here is a separate kingdom. One important distinction is these 6 kingdoms you see on the left. These are the 6 that are used most typically in textbooks within the United States, whereas within Europe, we usually do not see bacteria and archaea as separate kingdoms, but rather one labeled Monera, which are these 2. Within these domains, the kingdoms that we focus on are animals, fungi, plants, the whole of bacteria, or sometimes called eubacteria, and archaea. This protista kingdom is found within slime molds, although protista are organisms which are unicellular, and so there are many of them, including these slime molds, but also kelp, red algae, and others. Before moving on to the table, one note for this slide is that humans are complex. And they are complex in terms of being high functioning, maybe if you're thinking about the brain, or that we're able to use tools and create and use rather large ideas, such as maybe infrastructure or community. But just saying that they're complex does not mean that they have more genes. So, even though we refer to humans as being complex, that does not mean that humans have more genes than other forms of life, which we would refer to as being less complex. The rest of this video will be this table of predicted gene numbers via DNA evidence from the species listed. The first kingdom that we'll be looking at are prokaryotes, and here it's as a group. The 2 species of prokaryotes are influenza and E. coli, and the brief descriptions are that influenza is a pathogenic bacterium and E. coli is a gut bacterium. As for the numbers, influenza is estimated to have 1,700 genes, while E. coli is estimated to have 3,200 genes. While writing out this list, I'll try and stay as neat as possible, but if you're curious, this list comes from the 2014 edition of the Oxford IB Diploma program and is found on page 142. The next kingdom on the list are Protista. Here, the species is T. vaginalis. The brief description is that this is a unicellular parasite and the number of genes 60,000. So already you have a comparison to the 1.7 and 3.2 thousand of these prokaryotes. The next kingdom, fungi. Here we have the example of S. cerevisiae, which is yeast. This is a unicellular fungus and it only has 6,000 genes in comparison to the 60,000 of this unicellular parasite. Following fungi, we'll now look at plants, and the first example is Oryza sativa, which is rice. The description is that this is a crop grown for food that has 41,000 genes. So we've only gone over a few examples from a few of the kingdoms, but already you can see the big differences in the number of genes that a species will have depending on which kingdom that it comes from. In this next example of a plant, Arabidopsis thaliana, or Thale cross, is a small annual weed with 26,000 genes. This last example of a plant, Populus tejocarpa, or black cottonwood, is a large tree with 46,000 genes. And you can see already rice 41,000, this weed 26,000, and a tree 46,000. Well, some might say that a tree is a lot more complex than rice, but there's this difference of only 5,000 genes, whereas a difference of 20,000 genes to a weed, which some might say is more complex to rice. And this is why earlier when I said that simply because we can say that a human is more complex using certain characteristics that doesn't necessarily mean that a human will have a lot more genes. Now moving on to animals, our first example, Drosophila melanogaster, a fruit fly, which is a larva that consumes ripe fruit and has 14,000 genes. This next example, C. elegans, is a small soil roundworm with 19,000 genes. And now we finally get to, let's say, us, Homo sapiens, humans, and we're a large omnivorous biped, and here biped means that we walk on 2 feet, and we have 23,000 genes. So compare that to the 41,000 of rice, the 26,000 of this small annual weed, and 46,000 of a large tree. We have fewer genes than this weed, but we still like to think of ourselves as complex. And here we have the last example from this list, Daphnia pulex, a water flea, and this is a small pond crustacean with 31,000 genes. And so from this list, you have this comparison that has humans, 23,000 genes, where other species in similar kingdoms, for example, animals or other kingdoms, they will have more or fewer, but in the end, that does not mean that we are better, worse, maybe different. It definitely does not mean that having more or fewer genes makes the animal or prokaryote, protista, fungi, plant. It doesn't mean that it's better or worse. So far, we know that these species have approximately as many genes as shown on this list, but we're not yet certain what that means. Does having more actually give some benefit? Maybe having too many is a cost, but there are certainly many researchers working on this topic, reading genomes, trying to find the similarities and differences, trying to learn whether maybe 1,000 of our genes are so similar to 10,000 genes from another species that our 1,000 genes do what their 10,000 do. Maybe the reverse is true. Hopefully someday I'll be able to make one of these videos explaining exactly why 23,000 is the perfect number for humans. But until then, you'll have to make do just with this list.